Hello and welcome to Season 8, Episode 3 of Bad Gays. My name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
And I'm Ben Miller, a writer and historian currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernrich.
Great.
Yeah. I love that we've been doing this show for 8 seasons, Hugh, and we can still, I would say, a good 55% of the time do an opening that isn't unbelievably awkward. But now we're drifting into banter, which we swore we would never do. So back to the script.
So last week we talked about the weird fascist son of a family of weird, mainly fascist socialites, Tom Mitford. Who are we talking about this week, Ben?
Well, weird and fascist are going to continue to be themes. We're going to be talking about someone today who I've been itching to talk about on this show ever since I first came across his work a couple years ago as part of the research into my dissertation.
Oh, exciting.
And you can hear me talk more about that dissertation on a recent episode of the Slate LGBTQ podcast Outward, if you're interested in learning more about that project, which is called In Search of Lost Time, Primitivist Homomythopoetics and the Self-Invention of the White Gay Man, and is about, as will not be surprising to anyone who's heard me talk on this show, the influence of anthropology, ethnography, and other kinds of images of the other, colonial images of the other, on the white gay man and his subject formation.
Primitive
Homomythopoetics.
That's easy for you to say.
It's very easy for me to say. I have a PhD in it. But the character that I want to talk about today is an artist whose work is, I would say, mercifully inimitable. I think we should start, actually, by having you take a look at some of this artwork.
Okay.
So come over here for a second. Feast your eyes on this mural.
Wow. What is going on there?
Please note how much of it there is. You see, as I scroll at this image, it just goes on and on and on.
So it's a sort of pastoral, idyllic image, I'd say, of frolicking white twinks and girls.
No
no
girls.
Twinks. Okay, very, very twinky twink.
Some of them appear to be playing leapfrog.
Have you got girls? I've got
girls on mine.
Yeah, yet another Birdcage reference. And they're sort of in this sort of very nice green, oh my God, green utopian sort of land with a seascape behind and these beautiful palm trees and oak trees and all sorts. It's a vision of twink heaven.
Yes. So this white fascist twink heaven is a 30-meter cyclorama mural called Die Klarwelt der Seligen, the clear world of the blessed. And this was the masterwork, to use the term extremely generously, of today's subject, Elisàr von Kupffer. Kupffer was a masculinist fascist who based his masculinist fascism on a vision of primitive androgyny that was forged from different visions of Oriental and classical antiquity. He was a biological racist, and he was also part of a milieu of life reform experimenters and members of new religions on or near Monte Verita in Ascona, Switzerland in the 1920s. This world was taken up again quite explicitly by 1970s artists and activists of the generation of gay liberation. And so I think looking at his work and the work of some related people helps us see some entanglements between extremely contingent cultural radicalisms of both the 1920s and the sort of 1970s era of liberation. Kupffer, as I mentioned, was an antiquarian mysticist. He's also a white supremacist. And that mural that you saw was not only a work of art, but also the expression of his own new religion, which was called Clarismus or Clearism. And in that, we see a correspondence between this emerging gay subjectivity in the 1920s, different kinds of fascist masculinities, and all of these different pasts that people are calling upon in order to create their various political futures. One of the questions Kupffer asks at the beginning of his memoir, which is called Heroic Vision and Joyful Faith, is, what are we for in the world? And this is the question that keeps coming back in different gay liberation movements, right? What are gay people for? What is our social role? What is the social value of non-reproductive sex? And these are very much questions that Kupffer is involved in answering, and he answers them in ways that I think are particularly uncomfortable to those of us who are moved by politically or affectively maybe more comfortable expressions of a kind of anarcho-androgynous queer radicalism in the 70s. Things like Larry Mitchell's book, The Faggots and Our Friends Between Revolutions, and Ned Astis illustrations for that, right? We ended our book with it is how much we like that. And yet, Elisàr von Kupffer is part of a first generation of queer anarchists who are not left-wing radicals, but right-wing, misogynist, anti-Semitic proto-fascists. And what's particularly interesting about Kupffer is he additionally complicates our idea of what kinds of body politics accompany what kinds of politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
The traditional image of the fascist man, and often actually a critical feminist reading of certain forms of gay masculinity, relies on this, right? Is this hard, hypermuscular body, right?
Right, yeah.
The body as machine, the body as a kind of impenetrable, armored force.
Yeah, like the soldier and the farmer, sort of the people whose muscular masculinity will enforce the borders and grow the nation. And
Exactly. That body models border and models nation, right? Fascism inherits from liberalism the idea the head rational governs the body irrational, that colonized peoples, that racially inferior peoples are too much body, not enough head.
Mm-hmm.
And also the idea that the body, the male body, is a model for the body politic.
Right.
Kupffer presents us with a androgynous fascist masculinity, which I think is very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I think that means later in the episode. But let's start by talking about Kupffer's childhood. We're going to do a lot of reading from Kupffer's own writings, because he sure did write a lot, undisturbed by the fact that he couldn't write, just as he painted a whole lot, undisturbed by the fact that he couldn't paint.
Right.
So, again, the memoir, Heroic Vision and Joyful Faith.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big title for a memoir.
It's a very big title for a memoir. So, in this memoir, which is published posthumously, he portrayed himself as a figure of timeless greatness, searching out the secrets of human civilization needed for the future. In it, he adopted his chosen name, which was not Elisàr, but Elisarion. This was, he wrote, quote, no pseudonym, no hidden name to hide behind, but a name more consistent with its bearer than the social name E. von Kupffer. Clan and blood in honor, through 4 centuries I can name without gaps my highly esteemed forebears.
Wow.
Kupffer, quote, first saw the dim light of the confused world, end quote. It's a nice way of saying was born, into a German Baltic family in what is now Estonia in 1872. He was not only the son of the doctor Adolf von Kupffer, but also the direct descendant of Apollo, because his birthplace was on the same meridian as Delos, which is where Apollo in Greek tradition comes from. So very humble. And he wrote that he adopted that singular name Elisarion because when you're a great man like Raphael, Michelangelo, Dante, Eckhart, etc., these are his examples, you really only want to be remembered by one name.
Yeah, the modern name.
Exactly.
Madonna.
Cher. He wrote his first play when he was only 5 years old, and also, very early in life, became interested in, quote, the idea of eugenics, the procreation of healthy, valuable life, end quote. Now, this serene childhood was threatened by political developments in the region. The Baltic states at this time were governed by German-speaking nobles. Marx calls them cabbage junkers, right? These really sort of rough, uncultured brutes. But they referred to themselves as the Gelehrtenstand, the learned class, as opposed to the kind of massive. And this was Kupffer's worldview. And he moved from a childhood surrounded by this kind of pan-Slavic nationalism to St. Petersburg, where he studied in pre-revolutionary Russia. And he later remembered these times as, quote, times in the history of the earth when a kind of social earthquake collapses the whole magnificent illusion like a house of cards, end quote. In St. Petersburg, he studied Oriental literature. The Faculty of Oriental Languages in St. Petersburg had more than 700 Persian manuscripts and was producing a lot of prominent scholarship at the time. And in St. Petersburg, Kupffer also met the man who would become his life partner. And we have another wonderful term for life partner, quote, my fellow fighter for heroic self-responsibility.
That's what they call it.
Yes.
Don't come in, Mum. We're fighting for heroic self-responsibility.
Yes. By the way, how is your fellow fighter for heroic self-responsibility doing these days? Meyer was 1 year younger than Kupffer, and he was also from an aristocratic and highly educated German family in the East. Unlike Kupffer, he did not claim to be the descendant of any deities, but he was writing a dissertation on Schopenhauer, which is bad enough. The two of them were inseparable until Kupffer's death in 1942. They spent some time apart while Meyer was writing his dissertation. They united in Berlin when he was finished, and Kupffer started studying at the Berlin Royal Academy of Art. And like many bad gays, past, present, and future, they started going on holiday in the ruins of ancient Greece and Rome. And Pompeii had a huge influence on the couple, who were particularly, you'll be shocked to know, interested in images of sodomy and pederasty.
Mm-hmm.
And together in their research and writing, they began to blend several crucial ingredients which should never be blended together: racism, occultism, and a return to nature. And this mix came together to constitute that sort of transcendent adolescent androgyne that Kupffer built his whole theory around. Meyer and Kupffer were not disturbed, as some Europeans were, by the erotic graffiti of Pompeii. They understood it as part of a grand unity, a unity that was racial as well as aesthetic, and that pointed to same-sex life as something that was fundamentally spiritual and natural. Meyer had a writing style very similar to Kupfer's. This is his own English translation. He's writing in 1907 about Pompeii, and he says, quote, "Those to whom art conveys the pulsations of humanity's deepest heartthrobs are speedily brought into such intense personal sympathy with such works that they cannot endure the presence of objects that discourse to them in the foreign tongues of alien gods. We must recognize that our own life and our own art is rooted in that Caucasian civilization whose birthplace was the Mediterranean shore. In the immortal words of Jujubee, just say talk."
But this was like for a lot in the 19th century was an ongoing problem for people who were influenced by the classics, by classical civilization, was the problem of homosexuality.
Right, and their point was this is not a problem. If we take our racial heritage among the classical peoples seriously, then we must recognize that homosexuality is also part of our racial heritage.
Mm-hmm.
So Kupfer's first major work was actually a book. It was a book that returned to the past in order to discover queer futures. He began to collect in Pompeii the texts for an edited volume that appeared in 1900 in Adolf Brand's masculinist Berlin book series under the title The Beloved and Friendly Love in World Literature. This book was initially banned, but was allowed to be sold after classical scholars testified that it was a scholarly and not an erotic book. And this book was the first collection of gay literature ever published. There's an introduction by Kupffer, and then there are excerpts from different authors going from ancient Greek to ancient German texts all the way through to the sort of gayer bits of Schiller and Goethe that Robert Diemthoben talks about in that wonderful book of Warm Brothers about queer theory in the German 18th century. Kupffer wrote in the introduction to this book that he was writing, quote, against the ailing addiction to principles of our scientific time. And he named people like the sexologists Kraft, Ebing, and Hirschfeld as people who had misunderstood the same-sex erotic as a medical question, something that was related to gender inversion. And he said, this is ridiculous. Look at history. Look at Sophocles. Look at Alexander the Great. Look at Shakespeare. Same-sex loving men were, he wrote, quote, overrepresented among the outstanding representatives of our cultural history. This is kind of one of the first big explicit uses of what is a very common way of explaining
and defending
homosexuality, right, going all the way through to Larry Kramer. Kupffer insisted in the introduction to Lieblingminne, he was contrasting this kind of vital Greek poetry and then all that romantic literature about sort of sick, weak men and their love for women, that it was gay subjectivity that had what he called, quote, noble, vital elements for the future, that homosexuals had the manly soul, as opposed to the, quote, stammering, sensitive, small, lower, and poorer heterosexual poets. And so this is obviously part of the broader masculinist cultural movement, which is something we've spoken about a lot on the show.
Yeah, it rings true with that quote from Rem, where he's sort of mocking Hitler for being attracted to the peasant women in the field of their big butts in the air as they're harvesting the corn or whatever.
Yeah, very much so. Masculinism had several wings, right? Some wings of masculinism had more overlap with other movements that were beginning to develop these gay subjectivities than others. But what's true, I think, about those masculinisms that were part of developing these gay subjectivities is that, again, uncomfortably, these are some of the first people who were starting to think of sexuality as a political and an anti-minoritarian stance. This is the basis of queer theory, right?
Yeah.
The basis of queer theory is that we are a political category as opposed to a fixed biological minority. The first people articulating this are also anti-Semites and, like, profound haters of women. They are anarchists in the way that a lot of queer theorists are ambivalently anarchist, but they are anarchist in an individualist anarchist sense that ends up being quite compatible in many cases, as we will see later, with fascism.
Mystical fascism.
Yes. So a lot of people had already traveled from Germany to the Mediterranean in search of sex that you could sort of class up with the trappings of antiquity, right? There's the art historian Johann Josef Winkelmann, who will come back later in this episode. There's Wilhelm von Gloden, who's probably long overdue, who's a German photographer about 20 years older than Kupffer, who photographed erotic young male nudes posed along classical themes in Sicily. Kupffer, however, more than any of the others, really delved into a profound biological racism. In 1907, so 7 years after Lieblingminne, he publishes a pamphlet called Climate and Poetics, a contribution to psychophysics, in a pamphlet series about literature and medicine out of Berlin. And Kupffer has a racial understanding of climate. He defines climate as a combination of biology and geology. And specifically, he means race, and he means race in the sense of race science. He makes a reference in this text to something that Meyer wrote in 1904 in a text called The Life Laws of Culture. And the relevant passage from Meyer, so the passage that kind of explains Kupffer's understanding of race, is this, quote, "Cultural history is merely the accompanying music to the spectacle of race development. Culture is the life work of a race. The soul of all culture is race. Man's work comes from man's blood."
Wow.
So just pure biological racial determinism. Pure. Like culture only exists because of race. Now, in Climate and Poetics, Kupffer jumps off from this to make an unbelievably hilarious claim. Jarring tone shift coming. So he credits what he calls the blind powers of life for having made him change residence a lot, right? He was in the Baltic and St. Petersburg, and then he was in Italy. And right around this time, he was deciding to settle in Ticino, in Italian Switzerland. If you've never been to this part of the world, it is extremely lovely.
Mm-hmm.
If I could afford to live there for more than a day at a time, I might consider it. You know, there's in the background, you have these big, craggy, snow-covered Alps, and then by the shores of these blue, warm lakes, there are palm trees, right? And so here's how he described his chosen climate. Quote, "A climate can be rugged, like some northern ones, or soft, like many southern ones. It can combine abruptness and southern warmth, and possibly create a more bisexual type." So Kupffer thought that he lived in Italian Switzerland, which was a bisexual climate, combining the gay Mediterranean with the heterosexual Alps.
This sounds ludicrous, but it is a very common sort of assertion that people still, non-Nazi people today have, like, oh, well, the Spanish have this different political system because it's warmer there and they can go out and protest, or they have a different folk culture, or they're more passionate because of the Mediterranean, whereas, the reason our culture is like it is because of the rain. And
right. I mean, this is more connected, I think, to this kind of satitic zone concept from Richard Burton, right? This idea of a zone of sexual inversion around the Mediterranean, where specifically pederastic sexual relationships are part of the cultural norm. And that's a big theme in a lot of different late 19th century orientalist and homosexual texts. Yeah, absolutely, to do with climate. So there's this moment in Climate and Poetics where Kupffer describes his coming to this vision of this transcendent androgyne. And so he writes the following. "It is interesting to me retrospectively that the multiple and rich effect occurred when the appearance of the hermaphrodite in the Villa Albani seized me like a seer. I say this because my conception of hermaphroditism is quite contrary to the usual one. It is not the place here to elaborate this, although this almost transcendental view has also grown out of my experience of nature. It is not one of the known lying, but a standing hermaphrodite of the beautiful type and generally unknown, the more so as the Villa Albani, Winkelmann's former place, is strictly closed to the world." He then gives a reference to one of his own poems in a collection from the same year called At Eden's Gates Sufi Poems, and I am now unfortunately going to subject you to some of Elisàr von Kupffer's poetry in my own translation. It's not any better in the original. "In Aphrodite's luxuriantly beautiful abundance, but like the messenger of the gods, easy to move, so you lean there aroused by love's breath, the goddess's rich double shell. In thee are man and woman, yet indivisible. In the soft mass of your limbs, the world's divided soul is united again. Man's tempests have become a sweet wind. The woman's longing sings liberating songs, a mature youth smiling like a child, in whom I find all charms again, you proclaimer of happy future worlds. Only low delusion can revile thee with insult, and poverty repay you with hate.
I mean, it's kind of guff, no?
I mean, it's not just a bad poem. It's also a very interesting bad poem.
Yeah.
What Kupffer is doing is staging his conception of this transcendent androgynous figure as a kind of redemptive figure for the white gay man in the villa of the art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann. And he's doing that through a sonnet that he wrote and labeled Sufi. This social form is understood as linking the past, right, which is a woman longing for the past, smiling like a child, with male tempests and with future worlds that are also coded as masculine.
The dynamic
All of
male
this,
future.
exactly, and the soft female past
Yeah.
are united. And all of this is contained inside a book which assigns innate qualities to people based on biological race.
Mm-hmm.
So you see how all of this is kind of developing into what is actually legitimately a fascist
Right.
gay political masculinity.
And what's the Sufi link there?
The Sufi link is that all these different, and this is the kind of main claim I make in the dissertation, right? All of these different various pasts, whether they be classical, whether they be orientalist, whether they be primitivist, are flattened and understood as the past, the same past to which queer people found, or gay men specifically, found that they had been constructed by the development of sexuality. And so they over-identified with it and went back to look for the thing that they could then bring back and create.
So here he's sort of merging the sort of Roman and Greek model of the hermaphrodites
With Orientalism.
Orientalism, because Sufi is in Sufi mysticism, like the form of Islam.
And so in 1911, he holds his first exhibit of paintings in Zurich, and he announces that he has condensed his various philosophies into a new religion, which is called Klarismus. He writes some really terrible plays, which I'm not going to get into, because I think it's time to talk a little bit more about this 30-meter cyclorama painting, The Clear World of the Blessed, that we spoke about earlier. He built this painting into a purpose-built temple in his own house. It was open for touristic visits, and it was in Minusio, Switzerland, which was near Ascona and that Lebensreform colony of Monte Verita.
Right.
The painting has now been moved onto Monte Verita itself. When Edward von Meyer died in the late 1960s, he donated the house to the local canton to be used as an art center, and they wanted the house to use for stuff, but they did not want this painting, and so it was taken down by the curator Harald Seemann and put into a shed up in Monte Verita. If you are anywhere near Ascona, Switzerland, go look at this. I cannot emphasize enough how much this is unlike anything else you will ever see.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been a huge house of a 30-meter long mural.
It's a cyclorama, so it's in a circular room.
Right. Imagine going to a grinder hookup's house and you open the door and
It's a 30-meter. Jesus Christ. So the work was painted between 1923 and 1930. The plan was always to exhibit it as a cyclorama, and they didn't get the house properly built to hold it in the way that it was supposed to be held until 1939. So when you went into the house, you walked past the living quarters, and then you went through this very, very low, dark tunnel where there were lots of sort of ferns and Turkish carpets and,
Nice.
very, very dark. And then you emerged into this sunlit, skylit room where the cyclorama painting was. You're sort of staging the transition from what Kupffer called the Wir-Welt, the confused world, into the Klarwelt, the clear world. The work depicts 84 nude and androgynous hermaphrodites. All of the figures bear only 3 faces. One of the faces is Kupffer, one of them is Edward von Meyer, and one of them is the face of a favored model, Luigi Tarico, or Gino. He found Gino working in a monastery garden in Genoa in the early 1920s, and they just kind of brought him up with them, and he became their live-in model.
Model.
Well, you have a heroic fighter for self-responsibility, and then you have a live-in model.
Sometimes gays are just too much. Like, what is this, like a tunnel of ferns erupting out into your 30-meter circumference?
So I want to show you
Painting-
some
painting
pictures, and I want to describe to you what I'm seeing. These are a little more zoomed in than what you were seeing before. So here we have winter, where the various nudes do not seem bothered by the snow on the ground, and instead disport themselves in the all-together on lily pads, and they lift one another into trees. In spring, we have a lovely sort of Christ naked twink
Mm-hmm.
on a rainbow
Ascend
in front of a mountain. There are these like long-haired and short-haired twinks embracing in the grass. Everything is very like balanced and symmetrical in this really screwed up way. And if I zoom in here, you can sort of see, like, look at how the feet sit on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between like the form and the field, the background is poor. Like they,
Oh no, he's terrible. I mean, he's a terrible painting.
yeah, they're just sort of transposed studies of bodies onto this weird background. There's no integration between the two.
Summer's my favorite because we have not one but two what I can only describe as trees of twinks. So you see in this tree,
Is he getting spanked?
he appears to be like maybe.
So at the top of this very nice willow tree, there is another sort of floating twink. I don't know how he's being held up there. And then kind of over his knee is a blonde boy being bent. There's something going on there. He's holding him over
almost
his
like
knee.
he's going to be spanked. Yeah. One thing I also want to point out to you is that you see there's this distinctive V-shaped dimple across, like above all of their butts.
Okay, yeah.
That was one of his favorite details. That's a self-portrait there, by the way. That's Gino.
Not what I was expecting.
And that's Funmeyer. But if you notice, like, all of them have one of those three faces. One of the things I think is going on here is that we have this, in a way, extremely modern reproduction of antiquity, right? Antiquity here is being presented as a ready-made, something that's multiple, that's mass-produced. It's probably too cliched when talking about modern art to talk about the sort of split or fractured self. I think it's very interesting that someone who is constantly insisting on the sort of spiritual unity of everything, which, methinks that twink doth protest too much, is then portraying himself in this sort of radically split way, right?
But also the representations of the boys, even though, and this is like the strange enigma of art, which is that a nude dates itself very specifically. They're not classical representations of boys. There's something about them that's very modern.
They are. There's very, very 20s.
People would represent naked young men today, and it's not how people would represent naked young men in classical Greece.
And the second thing I want to point out about this is that, this is very different, this body, than the standard fascist male body, right? Arno Breker, a sculptor like that who does these kind of Aryan Superman fascist warrior, like big guys, and is a big favorite of Hitler, that we think as being a sort of typical classical artist.
Mm-hmm.
Kupffer is also doing nudes along classical themes, and also in a way that might be interpreted as homoerotic. Breker, I don't think, ever did a self-portrait as an androgynous long-haired dancing boy in a necklace with a little velvet doily around his ankle.
Right.
A lot of them have little heart-shaped velvet doilies around their ankles. And so this presents, I think, a little bit of a challenge if we want to be very literal about how we think fascist bodies are supposed to look. As usual, I think that we just have to be slightly less literal, and then it makes total sense. People who listen to the show may have heard us talk a bit about a book by Klaus Teweleit called Male Fantasies, about the ways in which men's fear specifically of the working class woman's body and of its supposedly unregulated flows, liquidity and softness provided a lot of the emotional and affective background for fascism in the German-speaking world, which is contrasted with the hard muscular body.
Whose limits are defined and certain, and which apparently doesn't leak.
Right. Along these lines, there's an article by Laurie Marhofer on the website called Outward about a really remarkable source that he found, which is the diary of a gay stormtrooper. And Marhofer writes about this diary, quote, "From the barracks where discreet manly caresses took place under cover of night, in the morning militiamen marched forth to beat anti-fascists to death. This mobilized a certain kind of far-right subject with a certain kind of sexual political ideology." Now, with that kind of fascist masculinity and its related homoerotics depended for their reconciliation of the masculine and the feminine on the governance of the interior by the exterior, I think Kupffer is providing a different reconciliation, but that's still founded on the idea that the unregulated feminine-coded flows have to be governed. Kupffer is extremely insistent that that painting is not supposed to be sexual or erotic. He produces volumes of accompanying material talking about how it's about spirituality and militarism, and it's very, very clean and uplifting, and it has absolutely nothing to do with sex whatsoever. And androgyny for Kupffer is, in a way, an adaptation of this same kind of anti-feminist imaginary. Women are eliminated from this world. Their assigned qualities are incorporated into these androgynous beings who are still basically men. Hard bodies governing flows and leakages, they don't describe these draped androgynes and trees of twinks, but work that is this erotic but completely avoids sex, work that is this insistence on its own purity and on its own distance from bad bodily drives, I think evinces that same fear of flow and fear of leakage and fear of what the body does if it's ungoverned that is crucial, according to Tablelight, to that fascist political project. And the final thing I want to talk about, and this is something that you need to look at another image for, is how these images kind of take tropes out of Orientalism, take tropes out of European representations of racial others, especially as related to sodomy, and then literally whiten them and Aryanize them as they bring them into the present. So here's two side-by-side images, and on the left is a preparatory painting, and the right one is a section out of the Clear World of the Blessed.
So the left one to me looks like a sort of idealized, orientalized depiction of two women in a harem, let's say, dancing. They're sort of wearing...
Well, that's Elisàr von Kupffer and that's Gino, so they're not women, but...
It's an easy mistake to make, no?
They're very androgynous.
They're
figures.
extremely androgynous. They're wearing sort of translucent veils and little bodkin type things.
Portrait
They're
of the artist as dancing boy/girl in harem.
Yeah, they're wearing sort of slippers and they're dancing on some sort of Persian carpet underneath a trefoil arch. And on the right, they're sort of transposed into a knockoff Botticelli type look, where
So
the figures are in exactly the same positions, but in the background is now the mountain, the Alps, and they're wearing feathers and they have flower blossoms in their hands. God, it's awful.
It's really awful, and their hair is blonde.
And they're blonde. Oh yeah, sorry, mistake. They are extremely androgynous. The pose, there's no like genitals on show.
The leg covers where the genitals would be of the one. The other one is turned around with that distinctive dimpled butt. These figures of dancing boys, sort of seductive, androgynous dancing boys, are a key visual trope in European Orientalism and are part of a depiction of the quote-unquote Orient as a place of kind of wild sexual desire that's going to trap the European man and drag him down into some sort of brew of bad behavior and degradation, right? So Kupffer is obviously aware of these discourses. He does a preparatory painting where he paints himself as one of these dancing boys in a harem, but in this very like de-eroticized way, right? Like these are not sexy, these pictures, right? There are some Orientalist images from this time that are kind of dripping with heat, regardless of what you think about the ethics of the desires on display.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't, right? But he's still depicting himself in this pose. And then he literally Aryanizes the bodies and puts them into his utopia.
Right.
So literally like, here is the Orientalist other. Now I'm going to take it, Aryanize it, and put it into my future.
But what was the function of him in doing the first picture as a sort of Orientalized version in the first place?
As a study, and I think he's like showing us as he's developing pose ideas for the whole piece. The first picture is called Temple Dance, by the way. As he's developing these ideas for the whole piece, I think he's showing us his workings, basically, like showing us where he's going to get some of these ideas about.
Or he's just harvesting old work that he liked.
Right. But he's also, but he's developing the images of these figures and then it culminates in these painting, right? So he's placing himself in this racialized and feminized position, literally making himself out of the substance of this racialized other.
Right. So this is back to your argument that these people were looking to these other cultures for like a universal homosexuality.
Yes, and for something that they could take
and
make theirs.
Yeah.
Right? So
as a part of a
when you build a 30-meter cyclorama painting in your home, you don't do it for yourself. You hope that people are going to come look at it. And so we're going to now talk about a variety of promotional materials that Kupffer and Meyer produced to attract visits to what they referred to as the Sanctuarium Artis Elisarian. And they promoted this to a wide spectrum of movements, from people active in sort of reform pedagogy and social reform, to colonial administrators, to tourist guidebooks, and to Adolf Hitler. We'll get there. So first, though, I want to read an extended excerpt from a satirical novel by Kurt Tucholsky called Castle Gripholm. Tucholsky, for people who don't know, is part of that kind of satirical Weimar urban cabaret left. He's straight, but he's connected to a lot of kind of queer people. And in this novel, the narrator, who's a writer, and his girlfriend, who's a princess, visit what they call the Polysandrion, which they refer to as the Scandinavian home studio Gesamtkunstwerk of a Baltic count named Polysander von Kupffer zu Tiesenhausen. So it's very clearly a take on this. And so he, quote, thinks he can paint, but he can't. But he does, and paints always the same things. His dreams of boys, the boys and above all butterflies. If he doesn't show himself, his boyfriend will explain the whole story to us, and it really needs to be explained. So they enter the villa and they marvel at what they see. So here we go. Here, Lord help us, a dream had become reality. The good Polysander had covered about 40 square kilometers of expensive canvas and paint. Here the young man stood and rested. There they floated and danced, and it was always the same young man. Pale pink, blue, and yellow. In front were the youths, and behind was the perspective. Oh God, the butterflies. They fluttered in the painted air. They sat down on the round shoulders of the young men. And if one had previously believed that butterflies rest on blossoms, this now proved to be a mistake. These ones preferred the young men's buttocks. It was all very lyrical. So they're gazing at this in wonderment, and then the boyfriend, who's clearly a parody of Meyer, emerges to explain. Quote, an elderly, pleasant-looking man. He was dressed in a bourgeois manner, but it seems as if he despised the gray clothes of our gray century, and the suit forgave him for it. He looked like an ephebe. Murmuring, he introduced himself and began to explain. In front of a young man standing at attention with a sword and a butterfly, and with his right hand raised to his head as if in salute, the friend spoke in the most beautiful Baltic tone, singing and with all the rolling R's. What you see here is a completely spiritualized militarism. I turned away in shock. And we saw dancing boys. They wore sailor suits with flap collars, and at their heads hung little pom-pom fringes, the same lamps that hung in the corridors of the house, a fully furnished realm of the blessed. Here a paradise had blossomed, of which so much of the painter's bosom buddies carried a little bit deep in their souls. Whether it was unjust persecution or whatever, when they dreamed in soft sky blue, the pinkest kind of blue, you might say, and they were rather proud of it. On one wall hung a photograph of the artist from his Italian days. He was dressed only in sandals and a Hoya-to-Ho spear. Apparently bellies were all the rage in Capri. It takes your breath away, says the princess when we were outside. They're not all like that, are they?
Unfortunately, yes, most of them are.
Well, so this is like obviously a very satirical description, but it's also largely accurate. One of the reasons why I think this is interesting is not only because it's hilarious, but also because it shows that this was a weirdo off in his own corner, but it was also a weirdo who you could do a little satire of in your novel, and at least some people would get it.
Yeah.
So this is one of several attempts at this time to build occult temples in 1920s Europe and specifically Germany. At Monte Verita, a little ways away, an artist named Fidus was trying to create a temple of the earth. There were different kinds of, woo-woo and occultist movements that were around, and they were part of these kind of radically contingent Weimar radicalisms. There's a great book about the Bauhaus called Haunted Bauhaus by Elizabeth Otto, and she writes about how the Bauhaus is a site of occult thinking, of queer thinking, of feminist thinking, of right-wing thinking, of migrant thinking, right, of all these different kinds of othered and non-enlightenment knowledges, some of which are very good and some of which are very bad. And there's one example in there that I love to use to explain the contingency of Weimar radicalism to people. So can you think, Hugh, of a more uncontroversially progressive and brilliant example of Weimar cultural production than the Bauhaus foundational design course?
Right.
Right? It's like that. People still teach that way. It's like the Bauhaus, and they were persecuted. It was great.
That was the model for my foundation art
So
education.
the Bauhaus ground course was based on the principles of a new religion called Mazdaznan, which was based on biological racism.
I did not know that.
So it's not that I think that anyone who gets a Bauhaus-style design education is secretly getting biological racism smuggled in through the back door, which is an excellent way of describing having sex with Elisàr von Kupffer. But rather that these things are all entangled in ways that are uncomfortable and should be. There's a tendency, and I think an understandable one, to want to split the Weimar period in two and to think about some things as being these amazing examples of progressive culture and some things as being the pure conveyor belt to fascism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially in a very troubled political time, we need to think a little bit more carefully about the ways that these things are always more complicated, and things can be both, right? Things can both have resonance in later far-right and fascist thinking and governance in very deadly ways, and also have resonance in thinking about progressive and thinking and working progressively, right?
Right.
Another way of thinking about this is the reputation of occultism in the English and German-speaking worlds is so radically different, right? Every sort of young lefty queer that I know in the English-speaking world is all into astrology and all into tarot and all into various magical stuff. And this is horrifying to German speakers who associate all of that with the Nazis.
Right.
And so you just see how these things, and I don't think that either side is right. I just think that, it's both. So Kupffer attempted to present this work, as I've said, as being pure and being clean. And so he wanted credentialed people to approve of it. He published a pamphlet that called it a source of healing and rejuvenation. And he included quotes in many languages from different scientists. He quoted a reverend, a famous physician, and an English lady. They wrote that this was a, quote, world of beauty and love without passions, a world of pure conscience. And he got this attraction featured in the guidebooks that were at this time a big part of middle-class travel through Europe. Baedeker, Meyer, Hachette. Some of these people had ties to different kinds of homoerotic and homosocial movements. So Dr. Karl Natter, who's one of the theorists of the Wandervogel, sort of proto-fascist hiking masculinist
Often
boys group,
pederastic.
often pederastic boys group, wrote of the painting, quote, like an eternal spring, it will infuse brightness and incentive into my entire life.
Yeah. It looks right up his street.
A British colonial educationalist named Theodore Morrison wrote that, quote, Lady Morrison and I are very interested in the ideas represented in the paintings. Kupffer himself wrote of the painting, quote, it is contrary to most picture shows, for its inspection is not tiring, but conducive to relaxation. Don't you want to go to an art show that just makes you want to fall asleep? It means elevation and enjoyment, a surprisingly novel world of which clergymen said that it was more effective than a sermon. The other source of authority that Kupffer and Meyer begin to call upon is National Socialism. And their connections to National Socialism date actually to the early Weimar years. During their first work on Clarismus and the building of the temple in Minusio, they were in contact with a Nazi official named Fritz Sauckel. He participated in the Beer Hall Putsch, and he ran a bunch of different Nazi front organizations, and then he became the regional head of the Thuringia wing of the party in 1927. Thuringia, by the way, is the state where several weeks ago a party led by someone who German courts have ruled I can call a fascist, Björn Höcke, came first in state elections. This Nazi official, Sauckel, was intent on turning the Wartburg, which is a castle north of Eisenach that's prominent in Wagner. It's a place where Martin Luther translated the New Testament to German. He wanted to turn it into a cultural center for the Reich they were hoping to build. And at one point, he proposed building a Claristic temple to house the cyclorama painting there.
Wow.
There's this great series of letters I looked at where basically the national Nazis put the kibosh on it because they're like, it's gay. And the local Nazis are like, what's gay? We've only read about it in books. They're trying to figure out whether it's gay or not. There were a series of unfriendly articles in local newspapers that doomed that project. But after the Nazis came to power, Kupffer reached out to an old acquaintance, a Dr. Lammers, who is now a state secretary in the Reichschancellery in 1935. He was trying to get permission to move money from family sources in Germany to him in Switzerland to keep living. So there was a motive for it. But the way that he writes in these letters makes it very clear to me, and especially in conversation with what he wrote earlier, that he understood his philosophy to be completely compatible with Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
The Nazis didn't, but he did. And so he writes, quote, I'm looking for a benevolent opinion from the Führer or the regime regarding, end quote, regarding the work. There was a sister of a high-ranking Nazi who had visited earlier that year, and she thought that the whole thing belonged in Germany and thought that Hitler might be willing to help. And so he wrote that, quote, I had heard that Hitler was pleased to take note of my mission, which is why I take the liberty of approaching you with such a polite request. He got a very formal response. It doesn't seem like there was such an exchange. The Nazis, to make it clear again, did not think that Kupffer's Klarwelt was compatible with their ideology. Nazi bureaucrats decided to commission a report to decide whether this request should be moved up the ladder or not. And they decided that the paintings were a Greek decadence. It was in this same year that the Nazis sharpened the existing Weimar era sodomy law. They defined it as a felony and they increased the prison sentence. They relied on two evaluations for this rejecting of the work, and the evaluations were carried out by the German consulate in that part of Switzerland. The first was done in 1926. It was done by the Weimar state, but they still relied on it. It said that Kupffer and Meyer were Baltic German. They could be considered German, but, quote, since they are considered to be homosexuals and their artistic work is associated with this peculiarity, they and their works of art have not escaped very different and opposing assessments. The new report, which was newly commissioned, wrote, quote, the murals are not Germanic but Greek in feeling, a glorification of homosexuality. The completely naked loving couples in the world of the blessed, in ever-changing tender positions, are sexually different only in the upper half of the body. The pictures will delight homosexuals. It does not speak of powerful, ambitious Germanicism, but of a soft, over-refined, decadent. They are, however, both opponents of the Jews. End quote. Now, despite this rejection, Kupffer continued to write to Hitler. And he started writing personally to Hitler. Hitler, it should be noted, never responded. The letters get more and more deranged as time goes on. There's one letter he writes in 1940, so war has broken out, and he writes that he hopes that peace will soon be established and Europe will be under Nazi control. And then he writes, quote, I dare to add one more thought. It would be significant for the people if you, as leader and head of the Reich, wanted to adopt one of the youngest Hohenzollerns, this is the imperial family, and thus establish a dynasty of Hitler-Hohenzollern, perhaps a great-grandson of the former emperor, a son of the prince who married a Russian Grand Duchess. The Reich heir you adopted would be brought up in the National Socialist spirit. Now, what's interesting about this is that this sort of pederastic adoption has often been a way for upper-class gay men to establish legal and social basis for intergenerational relationships. And the idea of this kind of mentor-mentee as great leader relationship form is a crucial part of masculinist ideology. In a weird way, Kupffer is suggesting that Hitler enter into a pederastic relationship with the Hohenzollerns to create like a masculinist spiritual basis for the Thousand-Year Reich.
Yeah, proto-gay marriage.
Yeah, basically.
But is also very, in its way, influenced by the Greeks, no?
But in a way also very influenced by the Greeks. I mean, it's confused, but it's fascinating and horrifying. Another letter in 1942, which was written only a month before the artist died, is the most passionate. I think you have to describe it as a love letter to Hitler. He writes, quote, since 1933, I have listened to all of your radio speeches in my sanctuary of art, but the most recent one has particularly touched me deeply. Even more so in the presentation of all that has been achieved in the struggle against blind cowardice, even more so as I myself have struggled for decades, suffering, for my new knowledge of the clear message, not with your brilliant success, but for the time being, as it were, as if in exile, as if imprisoned from my luminous creation, which meant an inner source of strength for many. As a 6-year-old boy, I had the first vision of my great work, Die Klarwelt. Klarwelt is a word that I introduced into the German language, and it had now been included in several lexicons. And you, unshakable leader, were called upon to create a foundation for the new Germany. I suspected that when you were a boy without knowing your name. I salute you for your courage in coming successes, despite all the power fools and devil priests. Very lonely up until now, I have nonetheless had faithful followers, especially in Dr. Edward von Meyer, who put all his means and his rich intellectual ability at my disposal now in almost 45 years. I had a comrade, the Song of the Faithful. Faithful is also familiar to me. But millions cheer you gratefully, and hopefully will become even more grateful to you. End quote. This is obviously an abhorrent letter. Right. I mean, he's talking about one of these Hitler radio speeches. Right. Kupffer is here explicitly identifying Hitler's project and his project as the same project. He links both of them together as these kind of pure fool, enlightened boy types. And then this nod to faithful followers is maybe this kind of wishful projection that Hitler was himself, like, same-sex attracted. Eva von Braun was not public knowledge in Nazi Germany. They kept her away because they wanted Hitler to be a bachelor that like young women could fall in love with.
And the impression that he was married to his job.
Exactly. But what that could have led to was Kupffer thinking that Hitler was,
that way,
a little that way. Exactly. In his 1943 memoirs, to come back to the memoirs, Kupffer wrote that throughout his life in his work, he had, quote, not meant homosexuality, not meant a step in between. And here he's using this word Zwischenstufe, which is the Magnus Hirschfeld word, sexual steps in between, but instead a step over. Nonsensically, this kind of homosexual nonsense has been thrown together with what I'm talking about. From a jumble of wrong judgments arose, from which also I had to suffer a lot. I could not have created my artistic work if not for the heralds of harmony and my rare race type manifesting in me.
So
Hugh, can you imagine looking at the clear world of the blessed and thinking that it has something to do with homosexuality? I personally cannot.
So is he, in his mind, disavowing the idea that he has what we would call homosexual or same-sex desires? He's saying, like, I'm not gay. Or is he saying, I have this one form of relationship, but it's not. Is he disavowing the acts, or is he disavowing the subjectivity?
He's disavowing the subjectivities and he's disavowing certain versions of the acts. We all assume that Kupffer and Meyer had some sort of a sex life. We don't know that. It's entirely possible that they had this like weird, who knows what was going on there.
Right.
I certainly don't want to speculate because whatever it was is not fun to think about. But I think this idea of the kind of socially productive and transformative attraction to this androgynous youth, which also includes becoming the androgynous youth, has this political component. And I think this is a nod, this writing, to the danger in a way that he must have felt in seeing a dream of radiant masculinity that was different in important ways to his, but related, play out, and in so doing, imprisoning and entrapping people that he'd corresponded with and people in whose journals he'd published. There are some friendly writings about Kupffer and Hirschfeld. There were apparently letters between Kupffer and Hirschfeld. After Kupfer's death, Edward von Meyer burned the letters, lest they cause later scholars to associate Kupfer's work with homosexuality.
Right.
This like profound disavowal. So this work lingers in total forgotten obscurity until the 1970s. In the 70s, this work is then taken up as part of Harald Seemann's 1979 exhibit on things that happened at Monte-Veritas. This exhibit travels everywhere. It's one of these exhibits everyone saw. And it's an exhibit that Seemann made into his life work. And you can still see this exhibit on Monte-Veritas. It's now been permanently installed in a museum there. And the exhibit was designed to draw connections between the cultural radicalism of the 1970s and this kind of 1920s avant-garde. In this exhibit, Kupfer's work was included. Also, the work of the artist Fetus was included, who we mentioned earlier. Fetus had similar dates to Kupffer. He wasn't gay, but he also drew kind of young men in the sun in this kind of Art Nouveau style. Similarly to Kupffer, he published in the masculinist journal Der Eigene. Similarly, he advocated for this kind of nudist eroticism, but without lust. Similarly, he tried to build a temple to his new religion. Similarly, he was a Nazi, but was not favored by the regime, but he also wasn't persecuted by the dictatorship. His work was rediscovered by California hippies in the 60s, who turned his work into the foundation of that kind of like Art Nouveau hippie poster design.
Right.
All those posters are influenced by Fetus, and the people doing them are all hippies, have no idea that the guy they're doing this with is a Nazi, right? There's a video on YouTube you can watch of Harald Seemann giving a tour in 1998 through the cyclorama painting. And he describes it as one of the few realizations of early 20th century utopian temples which had survived in their original form. It's a very lighthearted view of the work, and I think one that doesn't want to lean into the horrible complications of all of this, right? That one-sided correspondence with Hitler shows the limits of Kupfer's politics. They failed on their own terms, right? He would never be accepted as a true man by the Nazis, no matter how many letters of praise he wrote, no matter how much he denounced the project of homosexuality, no matter how much he denounced the left. And he died on October 31st, 1942, just before the Allies started to beat the fascists and win the Second World War.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for Season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show. Well, thanks so much for that, Ben, and for that insight into some of the things you covered in your PhD as well. Fascinating like very insightful. Had no idea about these guys, or indeed this thread, its relationship with fascism, and then its later relationship, I guess, with gay liberation.
Yeah.
I'm curious here about its relationship, which we kind of touched on, but didn't go into too much depth, with pederasty and the pederastic model that sort of reemerges, I guess, in the middle of the 19th century, looking back to classical models for homosexuality, and the difference maybe between those pederastic models and that relationship with the body, with, say, the other forms of masculinism. And I still haven't really got my head around the way that they maybe conceived of their relationships with these figures, not as aesthetic political models, but as sexual objects of desire, or whether they did in some way keep a clear delineation between the two things.
Kupffer was so opposed to the idea that anything in his entire life was erotic or sexual, maybe not erotic, but sexual, that there really is no account of his desire. I do think that the fact that what is most lovingly painted in all of his work, which is otherwise very slapdash, is the little dimples on the top of the twinks' butts, gives us a sense of what he was into, as does the live-in model, Gino, who was this live-in model who was discovered, I think, in his late teens. He's not a boy. He's a young man in the picture. Right. Certainly by age standards of the day, a young man and not a boy. There is definitely a pederastic element in their desire. As to whether Gino was being abused or whether they ever abused children, I don't know if we can say that. I don't know if we can know that. One thing that makes this a little bit different than some of the other pederastic models, and I think shows this as one of the weird transition steps between the sort of invert pederasty era of same-sex desire and the gay era of same-sex desire, right? What Peter Drucker has argued is that the gay era of same-sex desire is the idea that there are two partners of relatively equal age who might both be verse, as opposed to models that are either age or, in a way, gender distinct, right? Where there's a homosexualized invert who is the receptive partner, and there's often an age component to the insertive and receptive.
Following on from the Greek and classical models.
Yes, absolutely. Kupffer does two interesting things. One, he picks his ideal boy because the ideal boy looks like him when he was younger. And two, he paints himself into the paintings at the age of the ideal boys. So the ideal world is not the older patriarchs surrounded by ephebes. The ideal world is just the ephebes, and he makes himself one of them. So in a way, it's kind of a combination of both of these models in a way that I think is very disturbing, just to be clear. Like, I don't think this is good, and I don't want to excuse it. And that's how I would think of it. I think it's also really important to understand how these social transformations happen in ways that are often extremely unsteady and in ways that often include combinations of factors in these subjectivities that are developing that we find extremely strange and contradictory, right? You know, there's the famous cliche about history that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. And I think you really see that it's true someplace like this, where assumptions that seem to us unimaginable are somehow imaginable, right? No one, after the popularization of today's concepts of homosexuality, can look at the clear world of the blessed and not immediately like snicker and say the F slur. Whereas in the 1930s, Kurt Tucholsky, sort of smart, urbane writer who knows some gay people, points at it, snickers, and says the F slur in a very witty way, a way that's witty enough that I forgive him for the light homophobia there. And by the way, the narrator reassures his girlfriend that they're not all like that. And, you know, other highly educated people, right, like Theodore Morrison and various colonialists who just have no idea about any of this. And so to them, it's just like, you know, boys playing leapfrog, to go back to the birdcage again, right? Like, there's nothing dirty about it. It would be dirty if there were women. There's no women, so how could it be dirty?
Yeah. How do you think that transfers into like modern post-gay liberation era sexual politics around similar representations?
Well, that's really important. Thanks for bringing it up. Right around the time that these start circulating again in the 70s, not, I think, because people see these and take inspiration, but because similar kinds of system crisis, sex, gender change, cracking open winds are blowing. And so these things start becoming more interesting to people. There starts to be a big wave, another big wave of gay activists who start thinking about a kind of transcendent androgyny as an explicitly politicized response to crisis. So think about groups like the Radical Fairies, right, that conceive of a universal pre-Christian, androgynous social figure as an engine of social transformation. And they do that in often a way that has a very problematic and troubled relationship to native politics, but they do it in a way that is, according to their founder, explicitly communist. It's part of an explicitly left-wing liberationist ideal. And now many of us know radical fairies. Many of us have been to fairy sanctuaries. Many of us, in queer community, take inspiration from fairy or fairy-like documents, like the Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions, right? Where the faggots are envisioned as this mystical, out-of-time people who are androgynous, right? Who bear within them the qualities of men and women, and who are the keepers of this particular kind of flame of future utopia, right? When we realize that one of the main popularizers of this idea in an earlier era was able to completely cohere that with love letters that he wrote to Hitler, I think we have to think in a little bit more complicated way about what these kinds of politics mean and are. And I think really the big lesson is not that twinks are evil or androgyny is evil. The big lesson is that you can't tell if an embodiment, a political embodiment, is good or bad based on just the sort of basics of how it looks. Does that make sense? You will find communist skinheads and communist leathermen who someone like Harry Hay, one of the founders of the Radical Fairies, would have decried as being, masculinist, butch, almost fascist, these aesthetics are evil, whatever. You'll find people like that on the barricades. You'll find people like that, really fighting for political liberation for everybody, right? And then on the other hand, you'll find this person whose political body ideal is this androgyne expressing biological racism, expressing fascism, right? Aesthetics have less to do with politics than we want to think that they do. I think we learned the lesson that everything is political. And instead of thinking about the ways that structures of production and exchange and structures of race produce the things that we interact with also culturally, we instead decided that what that means is that the aesthetics of everything is the ultimate political act.
Yeah.
My final example here, right, is think about what's happened in the last few months as we've all watched this genocide occur in Gaza, right? And think about how different people in the art world have responded. There are plenty of people who paint pictures of flowers who have spoken up, who have lost gigs, who have lost work. And there are plenty of people who write long, complicated Deleuze-citing essays about their moss vitrines who have remained silent and kept taking the blood money to make the moss vitrines. So, it's not as easy to make these distinctions as I think a lot of people that I agree with want to think that it is. And I actually think that getting too basic about those distinctions is really politically dangerous and really reactionary.
So, bearing all that in mind, let's simplify it to the age-old question: good gay, bad not gay, bad not gay?
Bad for sure.
Yeah.
As for gay, maybe bi, because there's one moment when he's reportedly, and I haven't, there's a bit of dim sourcing for this, but there's apparently some moment when Meyer is really angry because he has an affair with a woman. But definitely bad, and definitely part of building this gay subjectivity. So I would say absolutely a bad gay.
And if people want to know more about this, what are the sources that I'm sure you have thousands for your PhD, but what are some of the sources they could read more about?
The PhD actually has 798 footnotes, Hugh, but some of which are to the same sources. There's a few things. One is the chapter of the dissertation itself, which I'm sorry you can't see. Someday in the next couple of years, it will be published as a monograph. I will certainly let people on the show know when the monograph is out, because I'll be hoping that some of them, for some unknown reason, decide to buy it. What you can do is read a short essay on my website, which I've linked to, which was originally published in a catalog by Hirmer after an exhibit in Munich. I'll also link there to some links to looking at pictures of the painting so that people can follow along. It really does bear...
No, I think you to understand how to see it work.
Need to look at it. Maybe when you're home, maybe not on your phone, but look at it. I'll also link to that Larry Marhofer essay there. And also Klaus Teweleit's Male Fantasies remains one of the best psychological examinations of fascist ideology I've ever read.
Me too. Well, with that, thank you very much for listening. I'm Hugh Lemmy. You can find me online, hugh.substack.com.
And I'm Ben Miller. You can find me at benwritesthings.bluesky.social, at Ben Writes Things on Instagram, at benwritesthings.com. And that's our show, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad gay. Bad gay. Bad.